The truth is often stranger than fiction, and most times more fun to listen to. Want a good story? Stories about real people. Heroes, villains, survivors, entertainers, and innovators. And some of them are true. Everyone has a story. This is episode number 10. It's complicated. Frozen. It's been one of the most popular children's movies of all time. Disney's version of the tale is about two sisters in a fictional Scandinavian kingdom. What you may not realize is how it's connected to another popular contemporary movie, The Greatest Showman. If you missed it, The Greatest Showman is a somewhat biographical musical about circus impresario P.T. Barnum, starring Hugh Jackman, who happens to be way more handsome than the original character. To understand how these movies connect, we need to go back to the mid-1800s and become acquainted with a talented but lonely Danish gentleman named Hans. Hans was living in Copenhagen and working as an actor. Gifted in his youth with an amazing soprano voice, he'd been accepted to the Royal Danish Theatre. But at around the age of 14, his voice began changing, as is typical when boys become men. Consequently, he needed to look for something else to do. Hans had demonstrated an early penchant for writing, so at the suggestion of one of his colleagues at the theater, he decided to try his hand at this as a profession. He wrote a short story, then a book of poems, a travelogue, and a play. He eventually began publishing more stories. Though his writings were not very well received at first, they gained popularity after being translated into English. As he continued to write, his stories became more and more popular with children and adults around the world. Hans was an innovative and influential writer. His stories were designed to teach children lessons of virtue and resilience in the face of adversity, as well as to inspire imagination and curiosity. His later works became embedded within the collective consciousness of the West and eventually the entire world. Over his career, Hans wrote over 3,000 stories, which have been translated into more than 125 languages. He inspired many recognized authors, notably A. Milne, creator of Winnie the Pooh, Beatrix Potter, author of the Peter Rabbit tales, and C.S. Lewis, author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Danish government even designated him as a national treasure. Everything seemed to be working in his favor, except for one thing. Hans could not find love. Despite his successful career, Hans was a lonely and unhappy man. In his diary, Hans wrote, "Almighty God, Thee only have I. Thou steerest my fate. I must give myself up to Thee. Give me a livelihood. Give me a bride. My blood wants love, as my heart does." Hans never married, but he did have an interest in a Swedish opera singer whose real name was Johanna, but who went by Jenny. Jenny was a renowned soprano, celebrated for the ease and naturalness with which she performed. Her sweet, pure voice brought her fame at an early age and made her a darling of European opera. She made her operatic debut in 1838, and by 1841, composers were writing parts especially for her. Culturally, theater was a more controversial matter in that time, and by 1849, she felt inclined to leave the European opera scene at age 29 for the sake of her personal convictions. It was Jenny's good name and character that prompted the American impresario Phineas T. Barnum to invite her for a concert tour in America. Barnum guaranteed her $1,000 from every performance, plus a share of the proceeds. Until then, Jenny was an unknown in America, and Barnum was taking a considerable risk. Without having ever met Jenny or heard her sing, he made the commitment based solely on the reputation she enjoyed in Europe. Barnum put his entire fortune on the line to make it happen. Other businessmen thought Barnum was foolhardy, but as usual, he proved them wrong. With Barnum as Jenny's manager, she had a successful tour in the United States. This story was part of the movie The Greatest Showman, except they took creative liberty with a fictional romantic relationship between Jenny and Barnum. Maybe it made the movie more interesting for some people, but it wasn't true. Jenny was a moral Christian woman of chaste piety, not the seductress portrayed in the movie. Also, Barnum wasn't half as appealing as Hugh Jackman. What's more, Jenny had a budding relationship with her accompanist, Otto Goldschmidt, whom she ultimately married. Regardless, what Jenny and Barnum had was a business relationship, and they both made a lot of money. Their association didn't destroy Barnum's relationship with his wife, nor did it lead to the end of Jenny's performances. Jenny's tour was cut short, probably because her lawyer, the notable attorney John Jay, kept poisoning her mind so she would make greater demands of Barnum. Jenny had benefited from Barnum's relentless marketing, and they eventually parted amicably. In the end, Jenny did complete 39 concerts, for which she earned a staggering $350,000. That would be about $11 million in today's money. The virtuous Jenny proposed to give away most of her earnings for building hospitals and orphanages, and to fund the good works of charities, including her friend Florence Nightingale's nursing fund. Now that you know all that, the fact that Jenny seemed so special to everyone, including Hans, would come as no surprise. Jenny was such a sensation that there were ships and trains named after her, as well as a town in California and a creek in Austria. Her image was even printed on Swedish 50-kroner banknotes. Hans expressed, "No book or personality whatever has exerted a more ennobling influence on me as a poet than Jenny." Well, Jenny was a significant source of inspiration for his work. In 1843, Hans wrote a story, The Nightingale, as an expression of his feelings for Jenny. Apparently, it didn't win any points with her, but it did lead to her becoming widely known by the nickname, the Swedish Nightingale. As for Jenny's romantic interests, before she settled down with Otto Goldschmidt, it's thought that she had a special relationship with Polish composer Frédéric Chopin before he died in 1849. Felix Mendelssohn was another admirer, but the virtuous Jenny had no interest in an adulterous relationship with a married man. Hans wasn't the only one whose advances Jenny refused. Although he might have been the most expressive about his feelings, Hans remained infatuated and attended Jenny's various performance engagements across Europe. He might have proposed to her on as many as 3 occasions. To his disappointment, Jenny didn't reciprocate his love and rejected him as a suitor. She thought of Hans as a sweet friend and simply didn't want a romantic relationship with him. At some point, she might have even become cold toward him when he persisted despite being turned down. As a result, Jenny's rebuffs provided inspiration for the rejected Hans, who wrote a story portraying her as an evil character with a heart of ice. The Snow Queen was published in 1844 by Hans Christian Andersen, the same fairy tale writer who gave us The Ugly Duckling, The Emperor's New Clothes, and The Little Mermaid. You're probably beginning to connect the dots by now. There have been numerous adaptations of The Snow Queen, the most popular of which is the Disney movie Frozen. If you've seen the movie and read the story, you'll know that Elsa has the same abilities as the Snow Queen in Hans' fairy tale. Although it's a Disney-esque revision of the Snow Queen, the inspiration for the character of Elsa was also the Swedish Nightingale, Jenny Lind. And that's their story. Thanks for listening to another great story. Wasn't that interesting? We allow these astonishing stories to stay alive when we share them with others. How about sharing this one with your friends and family, especially your kids? It makes a great topic for conversation around the dinner table. You're listening to the Everyone Has a Story podcast, a production of realmedia.us. I'm Rodney Powell. If you can hardly wait for the next episode and want to make sure you don't miss anything, add it to your favorites. I've got endless stories to share because everyone has a story.